Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Mann of the 1st Battalion, Middlesex Regiment, stepped off HMS Ceylon at Pusan on August 29, 1950, into a heat that stank of diesel and rotting rice. His men, 600 strong, were the first British ground troops committed to Korea. 2 months earlier, on June 25, 90,000 soldiers of the Korean People's Army had crossed the 38th parallel behind a spearhead of 258 Soviet-supplied T-34/85 tanks. The intelligence traffic reaching the Joint Intelligence Committee in London had been unambiguous from the first week. The Republic of Korea Army had almost no anti-tank capability, and the T-34 was walking through American bazooka fire as though the rockets were pebbles. General Douglas MacArthur's early dispatches, circulated to the Chiefs of Staff via the British Joint Services Mission in Washington, described US 2.36-inch rounds bouncing off the T-34's glacis plate at ranges under 50 yards. Clement Attlee's cabinet met at number 10 on July 6th. The Prime Minister, still 4 months from calling a general election, faced a defence budget of £780 million and a rearmament plan the Treasury insisted the country could not afford. Ernest Bevin, dying of heart disease at the Foreign Office, argued that if Britain did not commit forces, the United Nations resolution of June 27th would be exposed as an American operation with a UN flag pinned to it. Attlee agreed. The 27th Infantry Brigade was ordered from Hong Kong garrison duty to Korea with, in the words of one staff officer at the War Office, the kit they stood up in and a fortnight to think about it. The tanks were a separate problem and a graver one. The Middlesex and the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders arrived without armour. The Americans had lost 74 Shermans and Pershings by the end of August, many to T-34s that had learned to hunt in pairs along the paddy dykes. The Director of Royal Armoured Corps at the War Office, Major General Sir Frank Simpson, had spent 1949 arguing that the Centurion Mark III, mounting the new 20-pounder gun, with a bore of 84mm, was the finest tank in the world and had never fired a round in anger. The Treasury had funded 800 of them. They were sitting in Germany with the British Army of the Rhine, or in depots at Ludgershall and Bovington, waiting for a war that Whitehall had assumed would begin on the North German plain. On October 11th, the Chiefs of Staff Committee, chaired by Field Marshal Sir William Slim, took the decision. The 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars, then at Lüneburg with BAOR, would be stripped of their Centurions and sent to Korea. The regiment had fought its last tank action at Argenta Gap in April 1945. Its commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Sir William Lowther, was told on a Friday afternoon at Detmold that his squadrons would be at sea inside 4 weeks. 64 Centurion Mark IIIs were loaded at Southampton in early November aboard the Empire Fowey and the Empire Hallidale, chained to the decks under tarpaulins because there was no space below. The MOD signal ordering the move ran to a single sheet. The Hussars sailed on November 11, 1950. In the intelligence rooms at Northwood, the analysts calculated the Chinese order of battle building up north of the Yalu River and understood without needing to say it that the tank they were sending had been designed to kill Joseph Stalin's newest export. Whether it could do so in the frozen paddy fields south of Seoul was a question that would be answered in 14 weeks. The Centurion had been born of failure. In 1943, the Department of Tank Design at Chobham had been ordered to build a cruiser tank that could kill a Tiger frontally. 6 prototypes reached Germany in May 1945, 3 weeks too late. The Mark III, which entered service in 1948, mounted the Ordnance QF 20-pounder, a rifled 84mm weapon firing APCBC and APDS rounds that could penetrate 210mm of armour at 1,000 yards. It weighed 51 tons, carried a crew of 4, and drank petrol at a gallon per mile. The BAOR crews called it the Scent and complained about its range. Nobody had yet complained about its gun. The T-34/85, by contrast, was a known quantity. Fielded in 1944, upgunned from the 76mm original, it had crushed the Wehrmacht from Kursk to Berlin. It weighed 32 tons and could cross terrain that would bog a Sherman. Soviet advisors had trained the North Korean 105th Armoured Brigade at Sadong through the winter of 1949-50, and by June the brigade was, in the assessment of Naval Attaché Captain Vivian Holt in Seoul, the most professional armoured formation east of Suez. Holt was captured on June 27th and spent the next 3 years in a camp near Manpo. His last cable, decrypted at GCHQ Eastcote and copied to the JIC, had estimated the North Korean armoured strength at 242 tanks. He was out by 16. The Hussars' voyage took 41 days via Port Said and Colombo. Lowther used the passage to run gunnery lectures on the mess deck of the Empire Fowey, using chalked diagrams of the T-34s silhouette. He had obtained, through channels his adjutant later declined to describe, a set of Soviet gunnery tables captured in Berlin in 1945. The regiment landed at Pusan on November 14th and was placed under the 29th Infantry Brigade, commanded by Brigadier Thomas Brodie, a rifleman who had fought at Cassino and who, on being told his brigade would include a Centurion regiment, is recorded in the brigade war diary as having said only, "Then we'll be all right." The Centurions were unloaded onto flat cars at Pusan docks under the eyes of American officers who had never seen the tank and made no attempt to disguise their skepticism. The US 8th Army G3, Colonel John Dabney, wrote to 8th Army headquarters on November 18th that the British vehicle was too heavy for Korean bridges and too complex for Korean roads. The bridges in question had a nominal capacity of 40 tons. The Centurion weighed 51. Lowther ordered his squadron leaders to cross them anyway, at low speed, and lost no tanks doing so. The first tank engagement involving a Centurion in Korea took place on January 11th, 1951, near Yangpyeong, when Sergeant Cadman of C Squadron engaged and destroyed a T-34 at 900 yards with a single APDS round through the turret ring. By that point, the war had already changed. On November 25th, 300,000 soldiers of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army had crossed the Yalu and driven the United Nations line back below the 38th parallel. Seoul fell for the second time on January 4th, 1951. The 29th Brigade withdrew through country that was frozen so hard the tank tracks struck sparks. Lowther kept his regiment together, refusing to break up his squadrons in penny packets as the Americans had suggested, and reached the new defensive line along the Han River with 62 of his 64 Centurions still running. The line held through February. What came in April was different, and the ground where it happened had a name the British Army would not forget. The Imjin River flowed southwest across the peninsula 30 miles north of Seoul, and the 29th Brigade was ordered to hold 7 miles of its southern bank. The Imjin position was indefensible by any European standard. The 29th Brigade held a frontage of 11 kilometres with 4 battalions. The Gloucestershire Regiment on the left, the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers in the centre, the Royal Ulster Rifles in reserve, and the Belgian battalion attached forward. The 8th Hussars under Lowther held the ground behind. Their Centurions dug into hull-down positions on the reverse slopes of hills 194, 235 and 257. The brigade had 1 troop of Cromwell reconnaissance tanks, no minefields and no wire. The Chinese 63rd Army, 3 infantry divisions numbering 27,000 men, began to cross the Imjin on the night of April 22nd, 1951. Second Lieutenant Guy Temple of the Gloucesters manned a listening post at Gloucester Crossing that night with 16 men. He watched Chinese infantry wading across the shallows in the moonlight and called down mortar fire until his ammunition ran out at 0300. The Gloucesters under Lieutenant Colonel James Kahn withdrew to Hill 235 and were surrounded there by dawn on April 24th. Kahn had 622 men. The Chinese 187th Division had 8,000. Radio traffic from the hill, monitored by the brigade signals section, and recorded verbatim in the war diary, now held at TNAQ under W0281/1140. Records Khan on April 24th at 0800. Situation quite hopeless, but shall carry on. The Centurions could not reach him. The road up the Yangju Valley had been cut by Chinese infantry with satchel charges, and Lowther's C Squadron, commanded by Major Henry Huth, had lost 3 tanks trying to force it on the afternoon of April 24th. The 20-pounder was accurate to 1,500 yards, but could not depress far enough to engage infantry 20 feet from the hull. Huth ordered his gunners to fire canister rounds, high explosive fused to burst on impact, into the ditches. The Chinese answered with bundled grenades and pole charges. A Centurion of 4 troop, commanded by Sergeant Cash, was set alight when a satchel charge lodged in the engine louvres. The crew bailed out under machine gun fire. 2 survived. By the morning of April 25th, the Gloucesters were destroyed as a fighting formation. 41 men, led by Major Michael Harvey, broke out south through the hills. The remainder, now 526 officers and men, went into Chinese captivity. Khan was among them and would spend the next 2.5 years in solitary confinement at Pyeongtaung. The Fusiliers and the Ulster Rifles fell back through the Hussars' positions on the night of April 25th. Lowther's tanks fired their main armament until the barrels smoked, then reversed down the valley, firing coaxial machine guns at Chinese infantry riding on the tanks' rear decks. The withdrawal was led by Huth's C Squadron on the morning of April 26th. The road was 7 miles long, blocked at intervals by burning American M39 armoured personnel carriers, and lined on both sides with Chinese infantry firing at every gunport. Huth stood in the turret of his tank with a Sten gun and fired at anything that moved. Rifleman Henry O'Kane of the Ulster Rifles clung to the rear plate of a Centurion for the last 3 miles, and later wrote that the tank commander shouted down through the hatch, "Hold on, Sonny, we're going home." 5 Centurions were lost on the withdrawal. 34 came out. Every one of them carried infantrymen on the hull. The 29th Brigade had lost 1,091 men in 4 days. The Chinese 63rd Army had lost, by its own subsequent admission, over 10,000. The line on the Han was held. Beyond it, the war entered a phase Whitehall had not planned for. At the Foreign Office, the Imjin action was read as a political document before it was read as a military one. Herbert Morrison had replaced Bevin as Foreign Secretary on March 12th. He was out of his depth on Korea and knew it. The casualty figures reached King Charles Street on April 27th in a signal from the British Embassy in Tokyo, and Morrison took them to Attlee at Chequers the same evening. The Prime Minister's private secretary, Sir Norman Brooke, recorded in a note now filed at TNA under PREM 8/1405. The Attlee's only recorded response was to ask whether the Gloucesters could be reconstituted. He was told not before the autumn. The Cabinet's larger concern was MacArthur. The American commander had been sacked on April 11th, 6 days before the Imjin battle began, after publicly demanding an extension of the war into China. Attlee had flown to Washington the previous December on December 4th, 1950, after MacArthur's staff had briefed the press that atomic weapons were under active consideration for use against Chinese forces. The transcript of Attlee's conversations with President Truman on 7th and 8th December, declassified in 1976 and held at TNA under CAB 133/85, shows the Prime Minister pressing for a written undertaking that no atomic weapon would be used without British consultation. He did not get it. He returned to London with a joint communiqué that spoke of consultation and a private assurance from Truman that Attlee, according to his diary, believed in as far as he believed it himself. The chiefs of staff had, in parallel, begun to think about the war Britain was actually fighting rather than the one the Americans were describing. Field Marshal Slim's minute to the Cabinet Defence Committee of May 18, 1951, argued that Korea was a distraction from the main theatre, meaning Europe. and that British forces should be held to a level sufficient to maintain political credit with Washington and no larger. The minute is preserved at TNA under DEFE 4/43. Slim's calculation was that a Commonwealth division, formed from British, Australian, Canadian and New Zealand units, would satisfy the Americans and free the rest of the army for Germany. The first Commonwealth division was constituted on July 28, 1951, under Major General Sir James Castles, a Seaforth Highlander who had commanded 51st Highland Division in Holland. Castles was a professional's professional. Slim called him the best divisional commander in the army, and he took his command with two conditions. The first was that the division would fight as a formed body and not be broken up under American Corps command. The second was that the Centurions of the 8th Hussars and their replacements from the 5th Royal Inniskilling Dragoon Guards arriving in December would remain the divisional armour. Both conditions were granted. The Americans, having watched Hoth's squadron come down the Yangju Valley in April, made no argument about the tank. By the autumn of 1951, the war had settled into positional fighting along a line that would move less than 10 miles for the next 20 months. The Centurions, dug in on the ridgelines north of the Imjin, became the divisional artillery of last resort. A tank of the 5th Dragoon Guards on Hill 355 during the Battle of November 1951 fired 429 rounds of 20-pounder ammunition in 6 hours, more than any single British tank had fired in the whole of the Second World War. The barrel was condemned at the end of the action and replaced from stocks held at the base ordnance depot at Kure, Japan, that had been shipped from Woolwich the previous summer. The war would end at Panmunjom on July 27, 1953. What it had taught Whitehall was already being applied elsewhere. The Centurion's reputation, made on the Imjin, travelled faster than the tank itself. By 1952, the Royal Armoured Corps at Bovington was receiving liaison officers from 6 armies. The Israeli Defence Force sent Colonel Uzi Ilam in October. The Indian Army sent Brigadier Rajinder Singh Sparrow in January 1953. The South African Armoured Corps sent a 2-man team the same spring. The tank had become, in the phrase used by the Director of Military Intelligence in a JIC paper of March 1953, the most saleable British defence product since the Spitfire. The Ministry of Supply, which had been created in 1939 and would be absorbed into the MOD in 1959, ran the export programme from Shell Mech's house on the Strand. The chief executive, Sir Cyril Musgrave, understood that the Centurion could be traded for political advantage that no diplomat could purchase. Egypt asked for the tank in 1953 and was refused after King Farouk's overthrow. Iraq asked in 1955 and was supplied under the Baghdad Pact. Sweden bought 240 tanks between 1953 and 1955, designated STRV-81, and paid for them in iron ore. The Netherlands bought 591. Denmark, Switzerland, Australia and Canada followed. Vickers at Elswick and the Royal Ordnance Factory at Leeds worked double shifts through the middle of the decade. The largest single order came from Israel. Between 1959 and 1967, Israel took delivery of 293 Centurions, most of them refurbished Mark Vs from BAOR stocks. The negotiations were conducted through the Foreign Office by Sir Francis Rundle, who reported to Selwyn Lloyd that the sale carried a certain political weight in Cairo, but should be understood as commercial. It was neither. Israeli armoured crews trained by British instructors at Senelaga between 1959 and 1962 took the Centurion into the Sinai in June 1967 and destroyed the Egyptian 4th Armoured Division at Bir Lafan and Jebel Libni in 3 days. The Centurion, upgunned by the Israelis to 105mm, would soldier on in Israeli service until the 1990s. It was, in service life, the most successful export tank of the 20th century. At home, the story was more difficult. The successor program, Chieftain, had been under development at FVRDE Chobham since 1951. The first prototype ran in September 1959. The specification was demanding: a 120mm rifled gun, a Leyland L60 multi-fuel engine, and armour that would defeat the Soviet 100mm gun then entering service on the T-54. The gun worked, the engine did not. Field trials in BAOR through 1965 and 1966 revealed a catalogue of failures: cracked cylinder liners, sheared pistons, and a mean time between failures of 92 hours. The MOD's Director of Armour, Major General Sir George Cooper, admitted to the Public Accounts Committee in 1968 that Chieftain was the finest tank chassis in the world attached to the worst engine ever fitted to a British armoured vehicle. The Centurion, meanwhile, kept fighting. Australian Centurions of C Squadron, 1st Armoured Regiment, served in Vietnam from February 1968, based at Nui Dat, and fought in the battles of Coral and Balmoral in May of that year against North Vietnamese armour and infantry. Indian Centurions destroyed Pakistani Pathans at Asal Uttar in September 1965. South African Centurions crossed into Angola in 1975. The tank designed to stop the Red Army on the North German Plain had, without ever meeting a Soviet tank in the country it was designed to defend, become the most widely combat-tested Western tank of the Cold War. What Whitehall did with the political credit was another matter. The credit was banked and then partly spent in the Suez Crisis. The connection is not obvious, and no minute in the Cabinet Office files makes it explicitly, but the Egyptian nationalisation of the Suez Canal Company on July 26, 1956, was calculated by Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser against a specific British military capability. Nasser had watched the Centurions arrive in Iraq the previous year and had concluded correctly that the British Army could put an armoured brigade ashore at Alexandria within 10 days. The question was whether the Cabinet had the political will to order it. Anthony Eden had succeeded Churchill on April 6, 1955. His health was collapsing. He was taking Drenamil to sleep and Benzedrine to work, and the bile duct injury from his 1953 surgery was inflaming again through the summer of 1956. And his judgment, according to those around him, was intermittent. Sir Norman Brooke, still Cabinet Secretary, was recording in his notes a Prime Minister who could hold a Cabinet room and lose the argument in the corridor afterwards. The Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Sir Gerald Templar, told Eden on July 27th that the army could mount an operation but would need 6 weeks. Eden replied in a phrase Templar later repeated to the historian Robert Rhodes James, that 6 weeks is an eternity in the Middle East. The Operation Musketeer was mounted in the first week of November. The 6th Royal Tank Regiment landed its Centurions at Port Said on November 6, 1956, after the paratroops of 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, had seized Gamal Airfield the previous morning. The tanks moved south along the Canal Road and by dusk on November 6th had reached El Cap, 23 miles from the Canal Zone. At midnight, London ordered the ceasefire. Selwyn Lloyd had taken a call from Washington. Eisenhower's Treasury was refusing to support sterling. The pound had lost $279 million of reserves in the first week of November alone. The Centurions turned round. There was no fighting on the ground worthy of the name. The Egyptian army had withdrawn into the Delta, and the tank did what it had been sent to do. The political operation failed comprehensively. Eden resigned on January 9, 1957, and was replaced by Harold Macmillan, who had been Chancellor of the Exchequer through the crisis, and who had, in the phrase attributed to him by Rab Butler, first in, first out of the whole venture. The Foreign Office Review of Suez, chaired by Sir Norman Brooke and concluded in July 1957, is still held under Cabinet Office lock at TNA, and has been only partly declassified. What is known from the declassified portions is that Brooke's committee identified as the central lesson not the military failure, but the diplomatic one. Britain had launched a major operation without ensuring American support, and had discovered that without American support, she could no longer sustain a major operation for even a fortnight. The lesson was absorbed. It shaped every British defence decision for the next 30 years. When Duncan Sandys published the Defence White Paper on April 4, 1957, 3 months after Eden's resignation, the document announced the end of national service by 1962, a reduction of the armed forces from 690,000 to 375,000, and a policy of relying on nuclear deterrence rather than conventional forces east of Suez. The Chiefs of Staff argued against it in a joint minute of March 21st. They lost. The Treasury had won an argument that even Imjin could not. The V-bomber force was where the money went instead. No. 617 Squadron, based at RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire, took delivery of its first Avro Vulcan B.1 on May 20, 1958. The aircraft was the second of 3 V-bombers ordered against Air Staff Requirement B.35/46, which had specified a jet-powered bomber capable of delivering a 10,000-pound weapon at 50,000 feet over a range of 3,350 nautical miles. The Vulcan was Roy Chadwick's last design. He had died in a Tudor crash in August 1947 and never saw it fly, and it entered service alongside the Valiant, already operational from 1955, and the Handley Page Victor, which arrived in April 1958. Together the 3 types formed the V-Force, the airborne component of Britain's independent nuclear deterrent. The doctrine was Quick Reaction Alert. 4 aircraft, 1 from each of the main Vulcan stations at Scampton, Waddington, Coningsby and Finningley, were held cocked on the runway threshold, engines primed, cruise at 4 minutes readiness. The scramble time from siren to airborne was 15 minutes. The target list, held in sealed envelopes at each station and updated quarterly by Bomber Command at High Wycombe, allocated Soviet cities and military installations to specific crews. Kiev was 44 squadrons, Leningrad belonged to 50. Moscow was divided between 3 squadrons because no planner believed a single aircraft could reach it through the ring of SA-2 batteries the U-2 flights had photographed in 1958 and 1959. The Cuban crisis brought the theory into practice. The signal from the Chief of the Air Staff to Bomber Command, sent at 1800 on October 27, 1962, ordered the V-Force to Alert Condition 3. 90 Vulcans and Victors were dispersed to secondary airfields and held at 15 minutes readiness for the next 36 hours. The Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, was in telephone contact with President Kennedy at least 12 times between October 22nd and October 28th. The transcripts released in 1996 and held at TNA under PREM 11/3689 show Macmillan pressing Kennedy to explore a diplomatic solution, a swap of Turkish Jupiters for Cuban SS-4s, and Kennedy resisting until the Saturday night, when Robert Kennedy carried the offer to Anatoly Dobrinin in Washington. The Vulcans stood down at 12:30 on October 28th. No British aircraft had left the ground. The crisis had exposed once again the limits of the special relationship. Macmillan had been consulted, unlike Attlee in 1950. He had not been consulted as an equal. The Skybolt missile, on which the entire future of the V-Force had been staked since 1960, was cancelled by Robert McNamara on November 7th, 1962. Macmillan flew to Nassau in December and, in 3 days of negotiation with Kennedy, secured the Polaris submarine-launched missile as a replacement. The Nassau Agreement of December 21, 1962, committed Britain to build 4 ballistic missile submarines and to place the resulting force under NATO command, subject to a national veto reserved for supreme national interest. The V-Force had a decade of operational life left. It fought its only war in 1982 when Vulcan XM607 of 44 Squadron, flown by Flight Lieutenant Martin Withers, bombed the runway at Port Stanley on May 1st in Operation Black Buck. The mission required 11 Victor tankers to refuel the single Vulcan across 3,890 miles of South Atlantic. The longest bombing raid in history at that point. The runway was cratered. The Argentine Air Force did not use it to base fast jets. The tank that had come out of Imjin 31 years earlier was still in service in half a dozen armies, and the country that had built it was fighting its last colonial war. The Falklands taught Whitehall what Korea had taught it and what Suez had reinforced: that Britain could still, at the outer limit of her strength, mount and win a distant war, but only just, and only once. The task force sailed from Portsmouth on April 5, 1982, 3 days after the Argentine landing at Port Stanley. The first Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Henry Leach, had gone to Downing Street on March 31st in full uniform and told Margaret Thatcher that the Royal Navy could take back the islands. He was, according to Thatcher's account in her memoirs, the first officer who had spoken to her that day, without qualifying every sentence. She authorised the sailing that evening. The war lasted 74 days. 255 British servicemen were killed. 6 ships were lost: HMS Sheffield, HMS Ardent, HMS Antelope, HMS Coventry, RFA Sir Galahad, and the Atlantic Conveyor. The Argentine cruiser General Belgrano was sunk by HMS Conqueror on May 2nd with the loss of 323 lives, an action authorised by Thatcher's War Cabinet at Chequers that morning, and which remained politically contested in Britain for the next decade. The islands were retaken on June 14th when Major General Jeremy Moore accepted the surrender of Brigadier General Mario Menendez at Government House, Port Stanley. Moore signalled northward. The Falkland Islands are once more under the government desired by their inhabitants. The war had been fought without American ground support and, for its first weeks, against American diplomatic hesitation. Alexander Haig's shuttle mission through April had tried to broker a settlement that would have left Argentina with de facto sovereignty. Thatcher refused. It was Caspar Weinberger at the Pentagon, not George Shultz at State, who ensured that American Sidewinder missiles, satellite intelligence and aviation fuel at Ascension Island reached British forces in the quantities required. The relationship had held in the end, but its architecture had been visible. The Cold War itself had 8 years to run when the Canberra returned to Southampton in July 1982. The Cheveline warhead program for Polaris, begun under Wilson in 1974 and finally deployed in 1982, cost £1 billion, 3 times its original estimate, and was replaced by Trident, ordered by Thatcher in 1980 for delivery in the mid-1990s. GCHQ moved into its new headquarters at Cheltenham. MI6 continued to run the agents who, from the Berlin Residentura and elsewhere, provided the last decade of high-grade product on Warsaw Pact intentions. Oleg Gordievsky, the KGB's London resident and MI6's most important asset since Penkovsky, was exfiltrated from Moscow in Operation Pimlico in July 1985 by a team led by an SIS officer whose name has never been officially confirmed. The wall came down on November 9, 1989. The Warsaw Pact was formally dissolved on July 1, 1991. The Soviet Union followed on December 26th. Thatcher had been out of Downing Street for a year by then, replaced by John Major on November 28, 1990. The last BAOR headquarters at Rheindalen would not close until 2013, but the mission for which it had been built, to hold the Central Front for long enough for reinforcement from America and nuclear release from London, expired with the flag ceremonies at the Brandenburg Gate. The Centurion by then was a museum piece at Bovington and Duxford. 2,500 had been built. 17 armies had used them. A single squadron had come down a valley in Korea in April 1951, with infantrymen clinging to the rear plates, and the country that built the tank had spent 40 years discovering what that moment had brought and what it had cost.